I'm really happy to see that we got a nice crowd here for I think everybody's friend, Bill Hayton, who has probably become one of the foremost names on the South China Sea over the last couple of years. Bill is currently an associate fellow with Chatham House and a journalist with BBC. He's also the author of The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, which, in addition to being named one of the Economist Books of the Year in 2014, I can say is the best book I've seen on the topic in the last several years at least, and probably the best general history that we've ever had on the South China Sea. Bill also previously wrote Vietnam, Rising Dragon, which describes the diplomatic, social, political, and economic issues facing modern Vietnam. Today he's here to highlight some of his recent research on the modern origins, perhaps more modern than Beijing suggests, of Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And I'm very thankful to our Southeast Asia program for co-hosting the event with the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative. So we're going to have Bill give us a presentation and then hopefully open to a very interesting and maybe engaged Q&A afterwards. So,
yeah.
Bill, please.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Greg. Thanks to CSIS. It's really nice to be back here. And thanks to you all for coming. It's great to have so many people interested in my obscure topic. It's less obscure than it used to be. It's going to be a bit of a history lesson, but I hope you'll find it sufficiently stimulating. Really, this is the fruit of my research, helped by a few academics. A few sort of disclaimers. I'm not a China scholar. I don't really speak Chinese. I've had help from students and friends and paid translators to do a lot of this work. But I'm very happy to kind of to engage with people who think I've maybe misinterpreted, or if you've got better understandings. This is a work in progress. And so I really welcome the discussion and efforts to find out ever more about this subject. Since Greg mentioned that I work for the BBC, I do need to just say that today I'm not working for the BBC. These are entirely my own opinions and nothing to do with them. And I want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people have helped me along the way. So why do we care about, or why should we care about the history and the origins of China's claims in the South China Sea? I think there's a view among policymakers and people who write about the subject that somehow China's claims are special and different from other countries' claims because they are more historical. And I think that creates a sort of lens through which people look at the South China Sea issue, that somehow China's claims are more virtuous than the others. I'm going to argue that they are just as incoherent as everybody else's. I also want to argue that rather than seeing the disputes as inherently unresolvable because they are about matters of which we can't prove facts and so forth, that it is entirely possible to look at the evidence and interrogate the evidence and see whether it stands up. I'm also convinced that underlying everything that's happening in the South China Sea is China's sense of entitlement to the territories, which it gets from a particular reading of history, and that particular reading of history gives it a sense of righteousness in its actions, and that will inevitably lead to conflict, because I don't think it's going to go away. So I'm concerned about that. So the basic story is that before 1909, official China had absolutely no interest in the rocks and reefs of the South China Sea. It's a controversial statement, but I think I can justify that. The first claims emerge in 1909. 1933, China starts to think about the Spratly Islands, but in a not very organized manner. It's not until the Second World War, really, that the China claim extends as far south as the Spratly Islands. I'll go into that in more detail. My sources are English language newspapers and Chinese language newspapers from the region, South China Morning Post, Straits Times, Shenbao, and some others. Mainly written around 1933-34 as a crucial year, plus a few academic works. I'm very happy to share all the copies of all my research material with you all if you are interested. Now, one of the things, obviously, that we often hear is that China's claim goes back to ancient times. And there's a particular pattern in the use of evidence from the Chinese side, which is to take isolated sentences or scraps of information from historic documents and present them as being concrete evidence of claims. And here's one very good example. So from a document that was produced by the Chinese Foreign Ministry as long ago as 2000, it's one of the most complete statements of the historical claims to China. And in it, very typically, they take an old document, the Yiwuzhi, which is about 2,000 years old, and has a quote: "There are islets, sand keys, reefs and banks in the South China Sea. The water there is shallow, with magnetic rocks." And this is intended to prove that the Chinese people have collectively known about, discovered, and administered the South China Sea, quote, since ancient times. Now, it's important to remember that this document disappeared 1,000 years ago. So the copies we're working are copies or copies of copies of copies. Yeah? So however many mistakes and misinterpretations have been inserted in that copying process, we don't know. But more importantly, if you go back to those original copies, the quote doesn't say what the Chinese Foreign Ministry says it does. So Johannes Kurtz, for example, has written a very good paper which you can find on Academia, looking at some of these old documents and what they actually say. So this is what it says. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has removed the second sentence, which says foreigners reinforce their big ships with sheet metal. So this is not a statement saying the Chinese were going past this place, but that foreigners were going past this place. But that's removed from the Chinese account. Okay, and also it doesn't mention the word South China Sea. It just talks about the sea. So that's a gross misuse of historical evidence, which we can clearly see there. This goes all the way up to more modern claims. So there's a claim, for example, that in 1876, the first Chinese ambassador to the UK claimed the Paracel Islands. It's not what happened. He kept a private journal, which he used to then inform the Qing court about the things that he discovered on his voyage to Europe. And in that private journal, he wrote about sailing past the Paracel Islands. Interestingly, he doesn't use the word sisha, because the word sisha hadn't been invented. Sisha is only coined in around 1909, 1910. He uses the English words Pailasu, Paracel Islands, and it's clear from the context that he's getting his information from his fellow passengers on a P&O cruise ship, the Travancore, on which he's traveling from Hong Kong to London. So, 1897, a map of Guangdong province and Hainan. No need to mark any islands. They're not part of the concern of the Chinese authorities. Really, to understand why the claim emerged, one has to look at the political situation in southern China at the turn of the century. You've just had 1894-5, the Sino-Japanese War, the loss of Korea and Taiwan. You've had the Boxer Uprising and suppression of in 1901. You've had 60 years of unequal treaties, imperialists, Europeans, Brits, everybody taking little bits of China and imposing their authority. And you're starting to get discontent with the Qing. You have 4 uprisings alone in 1907 in Guangdong province and Guangxi province, organized by Sun Yat-sen supporters. You have anger, for example, the British wanted to impose their own anti-piracy patrols near Guangzhou in 1908. This caused a big reaction, and the Society to Commemorate National Humiliation was formed. And there are uprisings, and there's ongoing strife, demonstrations, a lot happening in southern Chinese cities at this time. And the territorial claim is basically an official response to show that it's doing something to stand up to the foreigners. That's why it happens in 1909. And the trigger is this man in particular. So General Li Jun, he was a very well-known military figure in Guangdong province at the time. He was responsible for suppressing a lot of the rebels' uprisings and was targeted for assassination. He was also alleged to be quite corrupt, as that little newspaper cutting implies. Now, in 1909, a Japanese merchant, Nishizawa Yoshiji, is discovered by a Chinese boat to be digging up guano, bird shit, on Pratas Island for use as an agricultural fertilizer. Pratas, if you don't know, it's occupied by Taiwan these days. It's halfway between Taiwan and the mainland coast, uninhabited island. Now, I think 10 years before, no one would really have cared about a Japanese man digging up guano. But in this atmosphere, it becomes a huge issue. And there are comments in the newspapers about the Chinese mind being very agitated about this, and there are demonstrations in the streets. And a boycott of Japanese goods is imposed. And this eventually, after several months, forces the Japanese government to reach a deal with the viceroy of Liangguang. Liangguang is the two Guangs, Guangxi and Guangdong, and Nishizawa. And basically the Chinese authorities pay Nishizawa $130,000 to leave the island, and in return the Japanese government recognizes China's claim to Pratas. So this is the very first time that you see China Chinese authorities using international concepts of international law to try and assert a claim to an offshore island. And so it's a really interesting period. And what is really going on here is a sort of sense that the Qing are suffering what one might call these days a legitimation crisis, that they're being accused of not standing up to the foreigners. Here is a moment when they can stand up to the foreigners, and they pay them a lot of money, but they fly the flag and they win the dispute. And while all of this is going on, attention is turned to the Paracel Islands at the same time. And another factor we see here for the very first time is this effort to go back to old documents and find evidence that can be used to assert a Chinese claim for the very first time. Before, nobody cared. Now, with this engagement with international law, there's a sense that you need evidence. And so they go back and find a mention of the island in an 18th century document to say, look, this is Chinese. And at the same time, the Self-Government Society, one of these local nationalist groups, goes out trying to collect fishermen's testimony to say that fishermen have always been there. This is, again, another part of the process of developing a sense of a historical claim, and it really only begins in this year, in 1909. So there's a sense among nationalists, among Asian people, that this is rightfully China's, but they don't have the evidence to prove it, so they have to go and find it. And while all this is going on, Li Jun himself, having launched the voyage to the to the Pratas, now organizes a voyage to the Paracels for the very first time. And a major expedition is launched, 3 ships, a high range of dignitaries, and 108 kind of laborers and people who go, and it's they have a torrid time because there's a typhoon and they have to kind of stay in harbour. And they spend 3 days in the Paracels doing the things that imperialists do when they discover islands, sticking in flags and firing cannons and declaring it to be Chinese territory. And it's much heralded. It's given. It's the whole thing is a great media show with regular updates from the voyage, and it's clearly designed to kind of be a sort of vote winner for public consumption. It's very much an attempt to show that the authorities are standing up to the foreigners and claiming Chinese territory properly for the Chinese, and it's one in the eye for the Japanese or anybody else. So it's very much a response to the domestic political crisis. And the very first time that China claims the Paracel Islands formally, 6th of June, 1909. But almost immediately after it happens, the Chinese authorities completely lose interest in the Paracels. So within weeks of the expedition, which sent all these giant officials, you see talk in the South China Morning Post that we're going to convert them into a penal settlement. There's no way they're going to make any money as an economic proposition here. They're just going to be used to house prisoners. And even that just disappears, and nothing happens for at least 10 years. So Chinese interest in the Paracels disappears after 1909. Of course, you have the revolution in 1911, and even after that it gets even worse. And even so, South China Morning Post from 1920, Europeans complaining that the Paracels is still a death trap. Why doesn't anyone build a lighthouse? Why doesn't anybody take responsibility for it? Now, 1921, there are some murky deals between Sun Yat-sen, based in the south, and Japanese interests, arms in exchange for development rights, that kind of thing. It's still a fairly murky bit of history. But not much else is really going on in the Paracels in the 1920s. But in 1925, the French send an expedition to the Paracels for the first time. And this starts to kind of alert the Chinese to the fact that they don't find out for quite a long time afterwards that the French, being the power in Indochina, are interested in the islands. And at the same time, Japan is increasingly interested in them as well. And this, you get a sort of 3-way competition of various sort of expeditions, commercial / state-backed enterprises taking place on the islands during the 1920s. It's only really after the formation of a recognized central government in China in 1928 that attention again turns to the paracels. It's as late as 1928. And Sun Yat-sen University sends an expedition, is given the sort of mandate to be responsible for the Paracel Islands, and sends an expedition there in 1928. And the professor who is in charge of it writes a report of what happened, and there's the copy of the report. One of the first things he says is that the paracels must be protected because they're our nation's southernmost territory, which was quite an assertive statement for the time, but of course now, in retrospect, it seems strange because, of course, China now asserts that the Spratlys, much further south, are its southernmost territory. But back then, it was only interested in the Paracel Islands as late as 1928. And again, another set of history writing. This guy, Chen Jianxi, who's a Kuomintang member, is tasked with writing a kind of history of the Paracel Islands, going back through old documents, finding sentences and things which bolster the Chinese claim. A sense that has to be presented in a kind of legal manner. Now, it's worth just putting this in the context of China's general anxiety about its borders at this time. And this is something I get from William Callahan's book. The very first map of the Republic of China had no borders on it, because there was a sense that foreigners had stolen land from China, and that it was an unanswered question as to where China's rightful borders should be. So, for example, in this map, Korea and Indochina were referred to as formerly our vassal, a kind of ambiguous status. Should we claim them? Should we not claim them? Land has obviously been taken in, by the British, by the Russians, by the Japanese. So this ongoing discussion about where China's borders lay, which was not resolved until really after the Second World War. And in the interim, individuals and private organizations and geographers in particular start to try to answer the question in their own way. So, for example, there's a whole industry of producing these maps of national humiliation, showing how much land has been stolen from China by the foreigners over the last century or two. I've used this map before. And they list these concessions. And you see the blue line is kind of the idea that this is rightful Chinese territory, which is clearly a sort of a reading of history, which is that these places, for example, the Sulu Sultanate down in Malaysia, what's modern Malaysia, Philippines now, used to send tribute to the emperor, and so this was rightfully part of the Chinese Empire, and maybe it should be part of the Chinese state again someday. Now, the islands of the South China Sea, and even the East China Sea in this case, are only really caught up in it because of the need to make the line continuous. They're not a specific focus of this, but they become caught up in it later on. So this is the most intense bit of history, and I just thought I'd shove it all on one slide to get it out of the way. It's complex, okay? So October 1928, Chiang Kai-shek's government is established in one central government after the kind of warlord fighting era. Partly really to try and resolve these questions about where China's rightful borders are, the new government imposes or promulgates new regulations saying that all the maps have to be inspected so that they all say the same thing. Now, this in the past has been treated as if it's some kind of sub-editing exercise. It was simply a question of tidying up maps. But I think this is absolutely fundamental. I think this process of regularizing the maps was actually about defining China's territory. And it's surprisingly unstudied, this process. And it really needs an expert in Chinese history to go and look at exactly this process. At the same time, of course, you've got the Japanese invading Manchuria, things getting really nasty in the northeast. So it's not surprising that the Chinese government has other things to think about other than the French government protesting against its plans to develop the guano industry and the paracels. It's also vitally important at the same time that the factions inside the Kuomintang who are opposed to Chiang's rule all converge in the south on Guangzhou and set up a rival Chinese government, the Southwest Political Committee down in the southwest, which basically spends most of its time just denouncing everything that Chiang Kai-shek does in Nanjing. 6 months after the French government claiming the paracels, the Chinese government rejects the claim to the paracels. And then shortly after that, a year after that, they finally get round to actually having a meeting of the Maps Inspection Committee. That's a bit rushed, but those are the key points because they all kind of play into what's about to happen next. So everything then changes because France, on Bastille Day 1933, annexes 6 of the Spratly Islands. And this causes a major reaction in demonstrations on the streets in China, protests from civil organizations. But it becomes, when you look at the newspapers, it becomes very clear that the Chinese government does not know where the Spratly Islands are. at this point. So it has to send requests to its diplomats in Manila and in Paris asking for maps. And we have an account from the American geographer in Manila of a meeting when the Chinese consul, Mr. Quanling Kwong, comes to him asking for a map of the South China Sea to tell him where the Spratly Islands are. And within a couple of weeks, it's clear that the government in Nanjing becomes aware that the Spratly Islands are not the Paracel Islands and decides not to issue a protest to the French government because it's only interested in the Paracels. However, our man, Admiral Li Jun, returns to the picture and gives interviews to newspapers in Nanjing and elsewhere saying, these are the islands that I discovered and claimed back in 1909, and it's disgraceful that the government is not standing up for China's rights. So he completely confuses the picture, giving interviews to various newspapers which are amplified and repeated. And the Southwest Political Council, the rival government in Guangzhou, use this issue to attack Chiang Kai-shek. And so they generate the publicity, they generate protests, but it's not the Chinese government, it's a rival government that are doing it. And a problem is a lot of the history that's been written subsequently about the history of the South China Sea uses as their sources these newspaper articles which were written in 1933 and 1934, which are full of the confusion about the Paracels and the Spratlys and contain other mistakes, but they have become the founding documents for a lot of the writing of the history of the South China Sea, and it's very problematic. So at the end of the 1933 row about the French annexation of the Spratlys, for the first time really, interest in these islands has become a national issue. Before it was really only people in the south. Here it becomes everybody in Nanjing. You get big protests. It's really a kind of anti-imperial, anti-French, anti-Japanese to some extent campaign. And these newspaper articles are really critical for spreading ideas about who owns the South China Sea. But it's also important to remember that the Chinese government, the central Chinese government, does not think it has a claim to the Spratlys in 1933, and its military council, military committee, agrees that it's not going to press a claim. And then the Foreign Ministry Gazette publishes an explanation for the Chinese reader who bothered to read it about why these islands are different and why China is not going to claim the Spratly Islands in 1933. However, the Maps Inspection Committee continues its work. And one of the first things they do is in the South China Sea is produce a list of names, Chinese names for the features in the South China Sea. And this is important because it shows you about the sources that they're using. And if you can read the Chinese, you'll see that this initial list is simply the translation or the transliteration of the existing British/European names. So for example, Spratly Island is simply transliterated as Sibalatwo, yes, Spratly. One of my favorites is Money Island, Jinyindao. It's the Chinese word for money, Jinyin, but it's actually named after a British a manager of the East India Company, William Taylor Money. They just took his name and translated it. And this causes a number of problems. Now, what's interesting about this is there was no Chinese surveying work going on, and because there are mistakes in the committee's list which match mistakes in other lists, I can pretty much be sure that the committee copied this British list from the China Sea Directory published in 1906. Using Google Maps, Google Books, you can simply kind of trace the misprints, and only this one has the same misprints as the Chinese list. So they copied this British list in 1906, or it was published in 1906. And then in April 1935, the same committee publishes a map of the South China Sea with all the names in place. Now, it's not clear to me that China is actually claiming everything on this map. Because, for example, they've created Chinese names for places in the Philippines which are not part of the claim. It's simply a way of regularizing the maps at this point. I'm open to question on that point. But even as late as 1935, there still seems to be no claim to the Spratly Islands. And in fact, the Spratly Islands are called the Tuansha, the chaotic sand. James Shoal is important because it appears at the very, very bottom of the map down there. And it's given the name Zhengmu Tan by the committee. Zhengmu is simply the transliteration of James, JM. But Tan is interesting because Tan means sandbank, a land feature, which it's not, it's underwater. So why does the James Shoal become important because it then becomes declared to be the southernmost point of Chinese territory, even though it doesn't exist. It's an underwater feature. Now, my guess is that why did they choose an underwater feature as something that was worth noting on that, is that I think, and this is my guess, the committee simply copied this British map, published in 1918, which gives particular prominence to the James Shoal and to the Vanguard Bank, and draws them with dotted lines. And so when and so the James Shoal there appears as a Zhengmu Tan being a land feature. This guy, Bai Mei-chu, he's not part of the government, he's a geographer, professor of geography, quite an important figure. He, in 1936, takes the work of the committee and prints it in an atlas for the first time for sale for commercial. And you'll see that in his atlas, he marks the James Shoal and the Vanguard Bank as islands, and then he draws a line around them. So the U-shaped line that we can see was first drawn on this map by a private man, and he drew it in this way because he was trying to include islands that don't actually exist, because he misunderstood the British map that he was copying. Yeah? So the sacredness of the southernmost point of Chinese territory comes back to some translation and cartographic areas in 1935 and 1936. So the situation kind of gets more chaotic because of the arrival of the Second World War. Japan occupies some of the islands. France is occupying some of the islands. One of the questions now that's often talked about is whether the Cairo Declaration promised the Paracel and the Spratly Islands to China. They're not mentioned at all in the Cairo Declaration. But there is this line that all the territories that Japan has stolen from the Chinese shall be returned to China. Question is, could Japan be considered to have stolen the Paracels and the Spratlys from the Chinese? Well, certainly not the Spratlys, because there were no Chinese forces occupying or had ever visited the Spratlys at this point. Paracels depends whether you think that they were rightfully Chinese or not, because again, there were no Chinese forces there, but a claim had been made. There were definitely French forces occupying some of the Paracels before the Second World War. So the Cairo Declaration is a very ambiguous document on that point. And the uncertainty you can see even in this is the China Handbook published immediately after the war, Ministry of Information document describing the country for foreigners. And you can see even there, the Spratlys are still known as the Tuansha, not the Nansha. Tuansha is chaotic sand. It's a translation of dangerous ground, the word that appeared on British and other international maps. And saying basically this territory is disputed between China, the Philippines, and Indochina. It's these guys who were geographers. Importantly, they are both students of Bai Mei-chu, the guy who drew the U-shaped line in 1936. They are geography professors. They go off to Germany and Japan in the 1930s to study geography. What kind of geography do you learn in Germany and Japan in the 1930s? Probably not the best sort. They come back to China with a determination to try and define the country's borders, and they are seconded to the Ministry of Interior to actually formulate once and for all where China's national boundaries are. And Zheng himself, in his naval captain there, he goes on the very first Chinese expedition to the South China Sea in late 1946. These guys, and in the meantime, the Philippines gets independence, and the Foreign Secretary makes a claim on the Spratly Islands. That kind of adds a sense of urgency. It also a sense of urgency because the communists are regrouping, and there's a sense that the nationalists have to defend their national legitimacy. Now, the 25th of December of 1946, there's a meeting in the Republic of China Ministry of Interior where they sit down to consider which parts of the South China Sea, which territories they are going to claim as China. And those two geographers there draw up this map. This is the very first time that a U-shaped line, 9 dash, or however many dashes it has, appears on a state document produced by China. Before they appeared in private documents, this is the very first time, an internal document for a meeting then. And you can see that the James Shoal is a particular objective. They seem to have just copied the line from Bai Mei-chu's private map 936, but there are mistakes even now on the map. They've got the name wrong, basically. And the name is in transition. It's a sketch map. It's only used for internal purposes. But this is now on the Taiwanese government archives. You can easily look at it. France gets in the game, and there's a kind of a race for the Paracels and the Spratlys in late 46, very early 47. Leaving the French kind of occupying half the paracels and the Chinese occupying the other half, and an uncertain position down in the Spratlys. That's the very first time any Chinese official lands in the Spratly Islands, 12th of December 1946. So that's when the claim reaches the Spratlys for the first time. And in the wake of that, a map is produced. This is the one you've probably seen many, many times before, drawn in December 47 and formally published in February 1948. Now, and again, we have the issue that there's still a lack of clarity about the James Shoal. Its name is still being translated. The word ansha appears to be invented at this time to be an equivalent for shoal, because they've recognized that tan is not the right word for shoal in this context. So, the claim is not ancient, but modern. It developed in response to political crises. In 1909, it was about standing up for the Qing against the rebels. In 1933, it was about the Southwest Political Committee standing up against the central government in Nanjing. In 1949, it was about the nationalists standing up against the communists. Elite knowledge about the sea was pretty minimal, but then expanded southwards during the 20th century. So therefore, the claim itself is not a natural thing, but the result of particular circumstances at particular moments in the 20th century. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much. All right, well, I expect that we're going to have perhaps a heated Q&A, but I'm going to start off with one question that jumps to mind, which is, it looks like the first reference to Macclesfield Bank is pretty clear. I didn't see at what point Macclesfield Zhongsha was expanded to include Scarborough Shoal, Huangyandao.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I mean, because the naming is interesting, because as far as I can work out, Pratas appears to be called Dongsha, Eastern Sand, well before this. It's known as a fishing location. But the word Sisha, West Sand, seems to be coined in 1909 to be an equivalent to Dongsha. You have East Sand and you have West, now we have West Sand. And then Macclesfield Bank appears as Nansha, Southern Sand, initially, because it's a sort of, a triangle. And then it's only in 1947 that the Nansha is moved south to become the Spratlys, and then a new word, Zhongsha, Central Sand, is coined for Macclesfield Bank. And I mean, there's simply no mentions of Scarborough Shoal in any of this, as far as I can see. And I think it's interesting that after the arbitration verdict came out, the Chinese government put out a new white paper about its claims and couldn't identify in that, as I recall, a single piece of evidence in favor of a Chinese claim to Scarborough Shoal. It could talk about maps of the Nansha Islands or maps of the South China Sea Islands, but it couldn't say anything at all specifically about Scarborough Shoal. I mean, a few years ago, there was a claim, for example, that a 13th century astronomer built an observatory on the Scarborough Shoal. The Scarborough Shoal is about as big as this thing we're sitting on here, and the idea that somebody found it and kind of built. And interestingly, in 1980, the Beijing Review had said the same astronomer built it in the Paracel Islands. So he's a very useful astronomer because he can be moved around the South China Sea to kind of claim things 700 years later. So yeah, so there's simply no discussion of the South. I mean, even the name, the Chinese name for Scarborough Shoal is Huangyan, Yellow Rock. But that name was only given to it in 1983. In 1935, they simply transliterated Scarborough as Sigo Baolo, and that name. And then in 1947, the nationalists gave it the name Minzhuo. Excuse my pronunciation, Democracy Reef. And then in 1983, the communists thought that Democracy Reef sounded wrong, so they called it Yellow Rock.
All right, let's open it to questions from the floor. Mira? Can you grab the mic? We have the webcast going.
Thanks. Thank you so much for a really terrific talk today. I have about 1 million things I'd love to ask you, but I'll limit myself to one question. You showed us the fact that the 9-line would appear to have its origins in the map of a private individual in the Republic of China. But one thing I noticed about the transition from that being privately drawn with its errors originating with the British map to the ROC official map that was finally published in 1947, is that that's when we go from a solid line to a dashed line. Was there anything in your research about the 1946 to 1947 period that suggests why, following the scramble for the paracels, the line became dashed when it was finally drawn for official records?
I'm going to use some work that's done by a Canadian PhD student called Chris Chung, who's studying his PhD at the University of Toronto at the moment, and he's been looking at the minutes of those meetings in 1946-47, and it seems very clear from what he's found is that they were discussing which islands to claim. There was absolutely no sense that they were trying to enclose sea in that, and so it simply, it's there, I guess, using the geographical convention of the day, trying to show which islands are being claimed. So it's no sense that it's trying to enclose. Why Bai Mei Chu chose to use a solid line is not clear, except maybe he's just following the tradition of those earlier maps of national humiliation and sort of, drawing a big line. That's all I can guess.
No problem.
And Mara, thank you for your service, as they say in these things.
Thank you, Bill, for your talk.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, Mara, you've done some fantastic stuff on this issue, so it's it's great.
Thank you, Bill, for your comments. Very informative. I'm David Rosenberg from Middlebury College in Vermont.
Yes, you have a very good website.
And since we've raised the question of dashes, I'd like to ask you a little bit more. You showed us the 11-dash line. Mm-hmm. Now the 9-dash line, or some would say the 10-dash line. But what was the reason for the switch, the removal of the 2 dashes in the Gulf of Tonkin?
Well, the story that's usually told is that this was a deal between the communist brothers in China and the communist brothers in Vietnam. This is obviously before, this is 53, so it's before there's a communist state in Vietnam, so it has to be some arrangement between communist parties, one assumes. I haven't looked into it in great detail as to why they took it out, but in the end, it advantaged China, ultimately, in terms of the final settlement that was agreed in 2000. At the end of the Sino-French border war in 1887, there was an agreement, the Sino-Tonkin agreement, which specified, kind of a particular line that would, run basically north-south from where the land border ended, and that all the islands on that side of it would be Vietnamese, and all the islands on that side of it would be Chinese. But when you actually look, and I have it on my laptop, the actual map that was attached to it, it's clear that it's not intending to kind of divide up the South China Sea, because the actual scale of the map is only talking about islands which are about 100 meters offshore. It's not intended to refer to anything outside the Gulf of Tonkin. And in fact, when Vietnam and China came to negotiate their boundary in the 1990s, they threw out that definition of the line, and they started afresh with a new set of things. So precisely why the Chinese thought that was a good idea, I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody, do you know?
Was it domestic or international?
I think it was about international solidarity, because there was also, I'm stretching now, but there was for a time, the Vietnamese lent China an island to kind of look after for a bit during the campaign against the French, to kind of sort of protect it from being occupied by France in the Revolutionary War, if you like. And then the Chinese kind of gave it to them back in the 50s. So that may just have been part of these sort of these tactical things which were agreed between two fighting communist parties at the time, I think. But I'm speculating.
In the back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a very interesting presentation. So it seems that the Chinese government is also adding the historical rights in the present period with regard to its claims in the South China Sea. So I was wondering, in your research, are there any mentioning about the historical rights, for example, fishing rights, etc., during the ROC period or even before, such as in the Ming Dynasty or in the ancient Chinese times? Thank you.
I can't find any mention of historic rights before 1990. In terms of rights to fish kind of within the U-shaped line. And from my rough research, that whole idea seems to come out of Taiwan in the early 1990s and is then perhaps picked up by the mainland. And I think it's an attempt to try to square the Chinese claim with the emerging doctrines coming out of UNCLOS, which we obviously agreed in 1982, and the recognition that UNCLOS wouldn't support some of the most expansive claims that were in the U-shaped line. And I mean, there are, kind of legal bases for claiming historic rights, but they are very limited in terms of historic bays and this kind of thing. And there have been agreements between countries in the past. I think the UK and Norway have some agreement about historic fishing rights, for example, and you see those being deployed in these kind of arguments. But no, there are lots of discussions about the fact that Chinese fishermen use these islands, and that makes them Chinese, that's for sure. But they're only talking about the islands themselves. They're not talking about rights in the waters around them. That might reflect, the fact that the relative lack of sophistication of kind of international legal thinking in China at the time, or just the sense that the sea goes with the land, and so therefore if they're ours, we ought to have the sea around it. I mean, the thing about fishing is, by and large, the bits a long way from land don't generally have many fish in them. Kind of, fish tend to kind of live around coral reefs and shallow areas and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think people really fished in the that much in the deep water. They were only looking at fishing in lagoons and near those outcrops. So I think the question of kind of owning the rights, in the very deep water of the sea just wouldn't have occurred to anybody.
Yes?
Hi, Ray Arnaldo, retired State Department and now AAAS. Nice presentation, thanks. You have a book out, so we're heartened to buy it, I suppose. Simple question, you mentioned the history of the Chinese claims and then a couple to the French claims. Has anyone else in the past made any claims to islands in the South China Sea? The Philippines, the Brits?
The Brits, we were there first. It's ours. 1877, I think, was the British authorities in Labuan, Borneo, gave the rights to claim it to again, it was guano that was the motivating factor. But then, like everybody else, did nothing to maintain it. And so never formally rescinded the claim, but I don't think anybody's thinking that they will make a big thing of it now. I think technically France claimed the parasols on behalf of Annam, and so that claim would have then passed to Vietnam. But it claimed the Spratlys on behalf of itself. And so it's kind of ambiguous, although it incorporated the Spratlys into a coastal province of Vietnam for administrative purposes. But you'd need to be a lawyer probably to argue whether the French claim was passed to Vietnam independence in '56, Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, or whether it continues in their own name. Japan obviously claimed them, but at the end of the Second World War, Japan kind of said no more. Now the Philippines one is interesting because, of course, Philippines was under American rule during the first time, Spanish and then American rule. But there are plenty of acts that were taken, during those periods, administrative acts, anti-piracy, kind of making maps, that kind of stuff, which the Philippines could maybe claim. And obviously one of the first, as I showed, one of the first things they said after independence was that we claim the islands, but they didn't go and stick a flag in any of them until much later. So the story that, I wrote about it because initially started to write about it because I just thought it was funny, and was Thomas Clomer, who was a Philippine shipping entrepreneur in 1956, went and claimed the Spratlys for himself as his own country called Freedom Land. And then when Marcos got interested in the oil possibilities in the 70s, Clomer popped up and said, actually they're mine, whereupon Marcos stuck him in prison until he signed them over to the Philippines for 1 peso. And until recently, the Philippines claim was slightly based on the fact that Clomer discovered the islands in 1956. Thankfully, they've got a slightly more solid legal footing now. But there have been sort of other individuals who have attempted to claim the islands for themselves. But I mean, really, I think it's fair to say that in terms of sort of permanent presence, the Philippines only really got in the act in 1970, or thereabouts, as a state. Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam, partly in response to what Cloma was doing, sailed around and stuck flags in, some of them in 56. Taiwan also came back, having left in 1950, in 56. So this is one of the things that one could try and unpick, is that if you, I mean, you'd be fair, it wouldn't be that hard, I think, with a bit of research. You could work out which state stuck their flag in which island. And if you disaggregated the lot and stopped talking about the Spratlys, the Paracels, and you started saying, what about Itu Aba, what about T2, what about Spratley, what about this? You could fairly, I think you could pretty much work out, you know, Taiwan has had a fairly constant presence in Itu Aba for the last, you know, kind of, you know, 70 years. But they haven't had a presence anywhere else. You know, Vietnam has occupied Spratly Island, Philippines has occupied Tutu Islands, and as far as I know, they haven't been occupied permanently by any other powers. So you could probably sort of, you know, I don't know what other people think, you could probably resolve it like that. If everybody just agreed, you know, chill out, let's just have what we have, and, you know, it'll be fine.
Yes?
Thank you. I'm Chinese from China. Yeah, from Shanghai, actually. I'm a rating scholar at GW, and I'm not specialized in international law. I'm specialized in international and foreign policy. Your conclusions here, you made the very remarkable, very, you know, and sounds similar like, you know, some evidence China claim in modern time. But from Chinese point of view, in many, you know, you have to look at back to the history. Your conclusion here, why I cannot agree with you, because you said claim development in the response to domestic political crisis is in the 1930s. How do you think about the Chinese in the transition of the 2 centuries, from 19th century to 17th century? China is not a modern country. Chinese people, because I'm doing international relations studies, in Chinese people, young students, actually in the particularly 1930s, nobody have the idea of sovereignty. It belongs to the, you know, the Qing dynasty, the Qing family. So when you talk about the Nanhai, how Vietnam, Philippines, all these things is connected with Qing dynasty. So nobody said it's ours because it's ours. So when after the World War, you know, World War I, before, you know, the many, you know, foreign, we call it the Western invasions to China. China many claim, you know, saw, you know, the land because it was, you know, split by similar, like particularly Japan, Taiwan, many, even German, you know, Shandong Peninsula, you know, was there, you know. So it's many problems when China is so weak. How China do that is ours, because we cannot tell because it's ours. So in the when you said the domestic political crisis, yes, I agree. I think it's in the Kuomintang governments, it's wrong with the political, because many people said we're anti-Japanese, we're anti-foreigner, because we should protect ourselves. Now we realize we are modern, we know sovereignty. So that from that time, I think you partly agree with you, this domestic political crisis response from the government. But how do you know, can you back to another, maybe 30 years, back to the 1960 or 1980, even the we call it 8 countries, you know, particularly during the Boxer Rebellion period. We are doing in China, many people really think the domestic affairs, who control the country, become a modern country. So Sun Yat-sen is doing the first, then Kuomintang, Jiang Jieshi and Mao Zedong civil war, then anti-Japanese war. So this for 30, you know, for the 50 years, China is doing this domestic war. How China have the capability and the idea of the sovereignty over South China Sea. So this is groundless when you say that this claim develops that just not ancient but modern. I cannot, from Chinese, maybe I think Chinese will agree with you, because it's different logic. We have to look at the history. I cannot give any evidence because you are international law, do
need
that.
to wrap it up.
Yes. So that's my experience. I should have. I think we should have a Chinese voice here. Thank you.
Great. I mean, I think this is what's fascinating. I mean, is you clearly feel it and you believe it, yeah. And I imagine an awful lot of people like you feel and believe the same way. But 100 years ago, you wouldn't have felt that, yeah. That it took it, but because that's what's interesting about these newspaper articles. When you read them, they are educating a population about a claim that they don't know that they have. And so they're actually generating a claim in the minds of the readers. You know, these are Chinese. Why are they Chinese? Because we found this sentence in a document which tells you that. But the people reading the newspaper didn't know. They'd never heard of these islands before. You know, these islands were the places where pirates roamed and smugglers and things. They were places, you know, that one feared. One feared to go past them if you sailed them. You wanted to keep the pirates away from your shores. There was no sense that these were places that one would want to, you know, fight for or anything like that. It's only in the context of, you know, as you say, the Germans and the British and the French and everybody else stealing bits of China that it becomes an emotional issue. Otherwise, you know, I mean, frankly, if these islands didn't exist, no one would care, really, would they? It's only because they exist and then they become a kind of test of strength and patriotism that then they become a big issue between the powers. So what's interesting for me is kind of that, is almost the sort of psychological thing about how people learn to care about these islands when they didn't care about them before, as you so pointedly demonstrate. I mean, the fact that every single 8th grade Chinese pupil is taught, you know, that the James Shoal, the Zhenguan Shoal, is the southernmost point of Chinese territory, is a deliberate decision by the Chinese government to do that. Okay, how are they going to get themselves out of that mess? You know, why are you claiming a piece of sea as territory when it's not territory? And just to bring this up to date, for example, people are worried now about or some people in this town anyway, are worried about whether China might declare an air defense identification zone, an ADIZ, okay, around the Spratlands. James Shoal gives China a big problem because China has a choice. It's either going to try and bring its claims closer into line with international law and draw lines around island features, you know, Spratly Island and Ituaba and whatever, and say this is our ADIZ, or these are our straight baselines. And if it does that, it can't draw a line around James Shoal because James Shoal isn't an above ground feature. Yeah? So it has a choice. It either includes a non-existent land feature in its straight baselines, or it excludes what 1 billion Chinese children have been taught is the southernmost point of Chinese territory. Now that might seem a rather obscure thing, but I bet it's the kind of thing that bothers people in Beijing. You know, people have been brought up on this sort of sacred text. So yeah, you feel emotional about it, but that in itself is an interesting question about why you feel emotional about it. And I think it's because you've been taught to feel emotional about it. Take the red pill.
Don Emerson?
Don Emerson, Stanford University. I wonder, Bill, if you could look back on your research and ask yourself this question. In the light of your research, was the decision of the arbitral court on the 12th of July suitable, not suitable? They really made what in many eyes I think was a radical statement that nothing in the Spratlys is an island. That has implications for the future, both for Taiwan, especially with regard to Ituaba, because I think many people expected Ituaba would be the one case where there would be an island with a 200 nautical mile EEZ. So from your standpoint as a historian, could you evaluate the court's decision and its implications?
Thank you, John. I'm a geographer and I make no claims for history, but there are no records of any settled communities on any of these features ever. You have descriptions of fishermen being left for example, a season, you know, with big pots of water and sacks of rice to kind of stay there and maybe kind of cultivate or collect coconuts or whatever while their colleagues are out fishing nearby. But there are no settled families or anything like that. And since UNCLOS, which is obviously an artificial construct, but it was agreed by all the members of the UN in 1982, specifically says human habitation, then they're not islands. I mean, the fact that you can fly in solar panels and desalination equipment, I mean, that's not what it means, that's not what the meaning of UNCLOS was. So they ain't islands in that sense, although of course, we don't have a word in English, so we can talk about islets, can't we, or features, and we'll still call them islands. So that just seems to be logical. And by extension, I think the same thing will apply to the paracels. I mean, if Vietnam really wants to upset the Chinese, then they could bring exactly the same lawsuit and remove the word spratly and put the word paracel in. And presumably they'd get a similar result. They won't do it, of course, because they don't want to upset the Chinese that much. So logically, I mean, in terms of the description of the features, that was the only conclusion that could be reached. And in terms of whether UNCLOS allows for just drawing vague lines in the sea and claiming all the historic rights between them, well, clearly it doesn't. That was the point of UNCLOS, was to stop countries doing that, to remove that as a basis for conflict between countries. China negotiated UNCLOS. It was a great victory for Chinese diplomacy. It kind of marshaled, non-aligned countries and other countries with, coastal states that wanted to preserve their exclusive economic zones. To do it, that was the compromise they reached. Why is China trying to undermine UNCLOS? I don't understand. The ruling said absolutely nothing about sovereignty, other than you can't claim sovereignty, in wide areas of sea. China can continue to believe that every single feature in the thing rightfully belongs to it. The tribunal said absolutely nothing about that. So why are Chinese officials deliberately misrepresenting what the tribunal said? Is it because they don't understand it, or is it because they're just trying to divert attention? Done.
Okay. I think we have time for one more. Yes?
My question will be, every government is trying to use the media to educate or influence the public and their people. And how do you feel as a journalist? And how do you think, how can the media be objective and help the people to understand what really happened and what is the truth, and not just increase the tension? And by the way, maybe there's another part of the question is, you mentioned about, I pointed out a lot that China misused the historical evidence, but how about the other countries? Because I think for me, I'm a Chinese, and for some other Chinese who are here or watching your presentation will feel, wow, there's a British and just they are trying to just talk about the misuse of the historical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that?
For once, the British aren't trying to grab territory in Asia, so hopefully we can be a bit more neutral about that. But the question you raise is a kind of massive question that faces all journalists, really. I mean, there's a thing called truth, and what I mean, if you want to communicate to an audience the story of the South China Sea, where do you start? Do you start 2,000 years ago, or do you start yesterday? Kind of how much can you actually convey in any kind of description of the problem? Yeah, there's always a balance between the attention span of your audience. Obviously you lot are prepared to sit here for an hour and talk about the history for that time, but you are a very small fraction of the television or radio or newspaper or web audience. Yeah, most of them just want to know, well, so what? When I first started writing about this, it was common for people to say the South China Sea matters because of all the oil and gas under it, but that's not really why the South China Sea matters. That matters to, it's part of the story. So the story has shifted to it's all about the USA versus China and the kind of who's going to run the world kind of stuff, and that's an easy line for journalists to hook in an audience. Yeah, but also it's as far as the Philippines or Vietnam was concerned, it's not really about that either. Well, I think that's part of the story. So you frame, as a journalist, you frame the discussion in a way that you think is going to interest your audience. So a Chinese newspaper is going to sort of talk about our historic rights being violated because they know that's going to get lots of Chinese clicks. Yeah. Whereas, you know, an American audience is going to, an American outlet is going to sort of stress, you know, China's threat to American interests in Asia or whatever. Europeans are kind of, where's the South China Sea? But the, you know, it's a bit like sort of, you know, world trade and the rules-based. We like rules in Europe, you know, threat to the rules-based order. But then if I try to explain to my mum what the rules-based order is, I'll be there for another half an hour or so. So we kind of use, you know, we use these shorthand, you know, things. So yeah, we have a responsibility to tell the truth, but you know, as everybody knows, the truth is a rather big concept. You know, kind of evidence, facts. One can talk about balance and so forth. But you know, no one will ever be happy. I mean, you know, on any subject, people will have different points of view and say, well, you missed out that, and you didn't include that, and you know, you're biased. Well, you know, that's always the way.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Bill. If everybody could please join me.